Chapter 1. The Forgotten Warning. The Return to Lonar Hill. The villager by Ranger had finally found peace. At least, that's what the villagers believed. Ever since Arjun had broken the ancient curse that haunted Lonar Hill, the strange deaths had stopped, and the whispers in the night had faded. But fear still clung to the hearts of the elders. They knew that some evils never truly die. Months later, 3 newcomers arrived, unaware of what lay ahead. Kabir Malhotra, a fearless ghost hunter and aspiring paranormal investigator. He thrived on debunking supernatural myths. Rahul Mehta, Kabir's best friend, a practical yet open-minded guy who believed in logic but was wary of the unknown. Ananya Mehta, Rahul's younger sister, an adventurous soul who had always been fascinated by ghost stories but had never truly faced one. The trio wasn't here to break a curse. They were here to disprove it, the village's fear. Their arrival at Ranger didn't go unnoticed. The villagers, once hopeful that Lonar Hill's horror was over, now grew uneasy. Some whispered among themselves, while others quickly shut their doors when they saw the newcomers heading toward the old Haveli, where Arjun had once stayed. At the local tea stall, the trio met an old man, Devanand, one of the few who had witnessed the hill's horrors firsthand. "You shouldn't be here," he warned, his voice trembling. "That place is cursed. It was never meant to be disturbed." Kabir smirked, leaning back in his chair. "That's what everyone says. But has anyone actually seen a ghost?" The old man's eyes darkened. "We have seen things far worse. And now that you've come, it might awaken again." A heavy silence settled around them. Even Rahul, who usually followed Kabir's lead, felt a strange unease creeping into his bones. Ananya, however, leaned forward. "Awaken what?" Devanand hesitated before answering. The curse Arjun broke was only a lock. But what if breaking it set something else free? The journey begins. Ignoring the warnings, the trio set off toward Lonar Hill that evening. The path was lined with twisted trees, their branches resembling skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. The further they went, the more the air grew thick, heavy, suffocating. Ananya paused. "Does anyone else feel that?" Kabir rolled his eyes. "Oh no, the spooky air. Maybe the ghosts are welcoming us." He laughed, but even he felt the odd chill that had settled around them. As they reached the abandoned temple near the base of the hill, Rahul noticed something unsettling. Deep scratch marks on the stone walls. "These weren't here before," he muttered, running his fingers over the fresh grooves. Kabir shrugged. "Probably wild animals." But Ananya wasn't convinced. Then why do they look like they were made by human nails? The sun dipped below the horizon. The shadows stretched longer. And as the first night of their journey began, an eerie whispering wind rustled through the trees. Something was watching them. Chapter 2. Return to the Hill. The chilling wind carried an unsettling whisper as Kabir, Rahul, and Ananya stood at the base of Lonar Hill, staring up at the looming darkness ahead. The twisted trees creaked ominously, their gnarled branches swaying despite the still air. Ananya hugged herself. "This place feels wrong." Kabir scoffed, switching on his flashlight. "You guys are acting like we just walked into a horror movie. It's just a hill. No ghosts, no demons. Just old folk tales." Rahul, standing beside his sister, didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the thick mist that curled unnaturally around their feet, moving as if it had a life of its own. Devanand's warning rang in his mind. The curse was only a lock. What if breaking it set something else free? Yet neither he nor Ananya wanted to turn back. They had come too far. With a deep breath, the trio stepped forward. The ascent begins. The trail up Lonar Hill had once been a simple dirt path. Now, it was overgrown with thick, blackened vines, as if nature itself had tried to seal off the place. The higher they climbed, the heavier the air became, dense, suffocating, charged with something unseen. Ananya wiped the sweat from her forehead. Why does it feel like we're walking against something? Like the air is pushing us back? Rahul nodded, noticing the eerie silence around them. No insects, no crickets, no rustling leaves, just their own breathing and the crunch of their footsteps. Then the whispering began, soft at first, a gentle murmur, just beyond the range of understanding. But with every step it grew louder, an eerie chorus of voices overlapping in a language none of them recognized. Ananya froze. "Did you hear that?" Kabir smirked. "The trees are gossiping about us. Let's keep moving." But Rahul wasn't convinced. He turned his flashlight toward the dense tree-line. For a brief second, he saw it, a shadow, tall, watching them from between the trees. And then it was gone. A shiver crawled up his spine. Something was following them. The ruins of the sorcerer's hideout. After what felt like hours, they reached the ancient stone structure, the rumored hideout of the cursed sorcerer. But something was different from the old stories. The once collapsed archway was now eerily intact. The ground, once covered in weeds, was now marked with strange symbols, freshly carved into the stone. Ananya hesitated. "I thought Arjun destroyed this place." Rahul frowned. He did. "So, why does it look like someone rebuilt it?" Kabir rolled his eyes. Maybe someone else came after him. Another traveler, another explorer. But before he could take another step, the temperature plummeted. A low growl rumbled from the ruins. Rahul's flashlight flickered. "Did you hear that?" Ananya reached for his hand. "We shouldn't be here." Then a shadow moved inside the ruins. Not fast, not flickering. It walked, deliberately, toward them. A breathless silence fell over the trio. Then, in a voice that was not human, the shadow whispered, "You should have never returned." Chapter 3. The Whispering Trees. The fire crackled weakly, its flames barely holding against the damp, unnatural chill in the air. The three of them, Kabir, Rahul, and Ananya, sat around it, their faces half lit by the flickering light. The vast, empty darkness of Lonar Hill stretched around them, swallowing everything beyond the small circle of warmth. Kabir poked at the embers with a stick. "See? Nothing's happened. No ghosts. No monsters. Just a spooky hill with a great campfire vibe." Rahul didn't respond. His eyes remained locked on the trees surrounding them, their twisted branches casting grotesque shadows that seemed to move even when the wind was still. Ananya shivered. "It feels like we're being watched." Kabir sighed. "You're just letting the stories get to you." But before anyone could respond, the wind picked up, a low, howling sound that carried something else with it. A whisper, soft, faint, almost too distant to notice. But then it grew, a voice, calling out, "Ananya?" She froze. The voice was familiar. "Ananya, beta, come here." Her blood turned to ice. It was her grandmother's voice. The call from the darkness. Ananya scrambled to her feet, heart pounding in her chest. "Did you hear that?" Kabir frowned. "Hear what?" But Rahul had heard it too. He stood up beside her, scanning the trees. "Someone just called your name." The whisper came again, drifting through the night air, like a breeze sneaking through a half-open window. "Come, my child, don't be afraid." Ananya's breath hitched. It was impossible. Her grandmother had died 2 years ago, and yet the voice carried the same warmth, the same soothing tone that had once lulled her to sleep as a child. She took a step forward. Kabir grabbed her arm. "What the hell are you doing?" She shook him off, her eyes fixed on the shadows beyond the trees. "It's her. I know it's her." Rahul stepped in front of her. "Ananya, no, that's not real." But the voice was so real, so close. "Come, Ananya, I've missed you." Before she could think, her feet were moving. One step, then another, drawn forward by the haunting melody of the voice. The forest loomed around her, the trees bending as if whispering secrets to each other. The further she walked, the softer everything became, like the world was melting away, leaving only the voice guiding her deeper into the night. Then she saw them, figures, shadowy, moving between the trees, watching, her breath caught in her throat. She turned around to call out to Kabir and Rahul, but they were gone. The campfire, the warmth, everything had disappeared. The circle of the dead. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears as she turned back toward the figures. And that's when she realized they weren't just shadows. They were people, or at least they used to be. Sunken eyes, gaunt faces, hollow mouths stretched into soundless screams. Their bodies were twisted, as if frozen in the middle of pain. They stood in a circle, surrounding something at the center, an old stone well. Ananya's breath came in shallow gasps. The whispering well. She had heard the legend from the villagers, the place where the sorcerer had made his final sacrifice, the very place where the curse had begun. And now, she stood at its edge, staring down into the endless darkness below. A shiver ran down her spine as she realized the whispering hadn't stopped. It was coming from inside the well. "It's not over." Ananya's lips parted. The words weren't coming from the well. They were coming from her own mouth. She gasped, stepping back. Cold fingers grabbed her wrist. Her scream ripped through the night. The rescue, out of nowhere, hands yanked her back with force. Kabir and Rahul. They had found her just in time. She thrashed against them, struggling to break free, her eyes still fixed on the writhing shadows around the well. "Let me go. I need to." The figures turned. For the first time, they acknowledged her presence, a ripple of movement, as if they were all inhaling at once. And then they lunged forward. Kabir and Rahul dragged her back, sprinting through the trees as the air behind them erupted into howls. The whispering had turned into screams, dozens of voices, shrieking, furious. The darkness itself seemed to chase them, stretching, reaching, grabbing. They ran, faster, faster than their lungs could handle, faster than their legs could carry them. The moment they burst through the tree line and back into the glow of the dying campfire, the whispers stopped. Everything went silent. Ananya collapsed, gasping for breath. Kabir looked at her, his face pale. What the hell just happened? Rahul's voice was barely above a whisper. "The curse, we woke it up." Ananya slowly turned back toward the forest. Between the trees, just at the edge of the firelight, something watched them. Something waiting. Chapter 4, The Blood Moon Prophecy. The morning light did little to chase away the nightmares of the previous night. Ananya, Kabir, and Rahul sat around the remnants of their dying campfire, their faces pale, their bodies still trembling from the encounter. The forest around them was eerily silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, no wind. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then they saw it. Strange symbols had been carved into the trees surrounding their camp. Deep, jagged markings that dripped with a blackish-red sap. The patterns looked like twisting serpents, empty eyes, and clawed hands reaching for something unseen. Rahul's hands clenched into fists. He had seen these symbols before, not in real life, but in Arjun's old journal, the warnings of the past. Arjun had been the first one to come to this cursed place. He had spent years researching the legend of the Whispering Well, the sorcerer's curse, and the spirits that haunted the forest. He had believed the curse was something that could be undone, and perhaps he had been right. But the symbols on the trees told a different story. Rahul pulled Arjun's old notes from his bag, flipping through them frantically. Then he found it, a hand-drawn sketch of the exact same symbols they now saw carved into the trees. And below it, in bold, hastily scribbled letters, was a warning. Do not break the curse. It holds them in. His heart pounded. The symbols weren't protective wards. They were warnings. Breaking the curse hadn't freed the forest. It had freed something else. The last descendant of the sorcerer. The only person who could help them now was Raghav, the last known descendant of the sorcerer. He was a reclusive old man, shunned by the villagers for his connection to the dark past of Lonar Hill. But Arjun had trusted him once, and now they had no choice but to seek him out. They hiked for hours, following a hidden trail through the dense forest. The deeper they went, the darker the air became. It wasn't just a thick canopy blocking the sunlight. The shadows themselves felt heavier, more alive. By the time they reached Raghav's hut, they were exhausted and on edge. The small wooden structure stood alone, half buried under twisting roots and ivy, as if the forest itself had been trying to reclaim it. Rahul knocked. No answer. He knocked again. The door creaked open on its own. Inside, the air smelled of burnt herbs and something rotting. And there, hunched over an old wooden table covered in ancient scrolls and bones, was Raghav. His milky eyes flickered toward them, as if he had been expecting their arrival. "You should not have come here," he rasped. Ananya swallowed hard. "We need your help." Raghav's gaze shifted toward the journal in Rahul's hands. He exhaled sharply. "Arjun thought he was saving you all, but he was wrong. The prophecy of the blood moon." Raghav motioned for them to sit. His gnarled hands traced the symbols on the table, the same ones carved into the trees. The sorcerer's curse was never meant to trap the living. It was meant to hold something far worse. A chill ran down Ananya's spine. "What do you mean?" Raghav's face darkened. "The forgotten ones." He turned toward an old parchment, brittle with age. It was a prophecy, a warning written centuries ago. The night the curse is undone, the prison will shatter. And under the blood moon, the forgotten ones will walk once more. Kabir's voice was barely above a whisper. "The blood moon?" Raghav nodded grimly. "It rises in 2 nights. And when it does, the spirits that have been trapped for centuries, vengeful, hungry, and wrathful, will finally be free. And they will come for the ones who broke the curse, the mark of the doomed." Raghav's trembling hand pointed at Ananya. "You've already been marked." Her breath caught. "What?" He gestured for her to roll up her sleeve. She hesitated, then slowly pulled up the fabric. And there on her wrist was a dark, twisting symbol. A mark that had not been there the night before. A mark that pulsed with an eerie, sickening energy. She was bound to the forgotten ones now. And the blood moon was coming. Chapter 5, The Vanishing. The forest was colder than before. The wind carried whispers, not just a rustling of leaves, but voices, faint, broken murmurs that seemed to come from all directions. Rahul and Ananya sat frozen in the small wooden hut, the eerie glow of the lantern casting long shadows across Raghav's wrinkled face. His words from the night before echoed in their minds. The blood moon will rise in 2 nights, and the forgotten ones will come for you. But none of them expected it to happen this soon. Kabir was missing. The footsteps in the dark. It had been past midnight when Kabir left the hut. He had scoffed at Raghav's warnings. "It's just some ancient superstition," he had muttered, strapping his camera around his neck. "People fear what they don't understand. I'll prove there's nothing out there." And then he had stepped into the night. When Rahul and Ananya woke, the door was wide open, the fire and the hearth long dead. The first thing they saw was Kabir's camera. It lay in the dirt just outside, its red recording light blinking weakly. Ananya grabbed it with trembling hands. The screen was cracked, but the footage was still playing, and what they saw made their blood run cold. The final recording. At first, it was just Kabir walking to the forest, whispering to himself about how ridiculous the whole thing was. He recorded the symbols on the trees, the thick mist that clung to the ground, the empty darkness ahead. Then the whispers started, at first faint, almost like the wind, then louder. Kabir turned the camera around, flashing his light through the trees. Nothing. His breathing quickened. He took a few more steps, and then the whispers turned into footsteps. Not his. Something else was walking. The camera shook as Kabir turned frantically, his breath sharp and panicked. A twig snapped. A shadow moved. And then, from the darkness behind him, 2 hands shot out, grabbing his shoulders. His scream was the last thing they heard before the camera fell to the ground. The screen flickered, showing only the dark outline of Kabir being dragged into the trees. Then static and silence. The hunt for Kabir. Ananya let out a choked sob, clutching the camera to her chest. "We have to find him." Rahul's hands were shaking, but he nodded. "Before the blood moon rises." Raghav stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. "You won't find him," he murmured. "Not unless you understand what took him." Rahul clenched his jaw. "Then tell us." The old man exhaled deeply. "They are the forgotten ones. Spirits that should never have been freed. They don't just kill, they consume." Ananya's heart pounded. "But he's still alive?" Raghav hesitated. "For now, they toy with their prey before the blood moon. They feed on fear. If you want to save him, you must act before sunrise." Rahul didn't wait to hear more. He grabbed his flashlight and sprinted toward the forest. And the whispers followed, the path of shadows. The deeper they ran, the colder became. The mist thickened, swirling around their feet. Shapes moved within it, half-seen figures, hollow eyes, stretching hands. Then they saw it. Kabir's jacket was torn and hanging from a low branch. His footprints were still visible in the soft mud, but they weren't alone. Something huge had left its mark beside them. Elongated footprints, clawed toes, too deep for any human. Rahul swallowed hard. "We're not alone." Ananya clutched his arm. "We need to hurry." Somewhere ahead, from the depths of the mist, a scream echoed through the trees. "Kabir!" They ran, straight into the darkness. Chapter 6. The Marked Ones. Rahul and Ananya stumbled through the dense, fog-drenched forest, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The air felt heavier, charged with an unnatural stillness. Somewhere ahead, Kabir's scream had cut through the night, then silence. But they weren't alone. The trees loomed like twisted sentinels, their bark engraved with symbols that pulsed faintly under the dim moonlight. Shadows slithered between them, shifting just beyond their vision. The forest was watching. Then Ananya saw it first. A faint glow. She grabbed Rahul's arm and pointed ahead. Through the mist, a structure stood in the clearing. An ancient shrine, forgotten by time. The shrine of the forgotten. The stone walls of the shrine were covered in faded carvings. Human figures with hollowed-out eyes, twisted faces frozen in expressions of agony. The entrance stood wide open, as if inviting them in. Rahul hesitated. This place, it feels wrong. Ananya swallowed hard. Kabir is in there. Steeling themselves, they stepped inside. The scent of damp stone and something metallic filled the air. Blood. The walls were stained with deep crimson, smeared in patterns that seemed deliberate. Symbol spirals and jagged markings ran across the floor, circling the lone figure at the center of the room. Kabir. The marking. He was slumped against the altar, his body unnaturally still. His clothes were torn, his skin pale, but what sent chills through them was his face. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, unblinking. Ananya dropped to her knees, shaking his shoulders. "Kabir, wake up." No response. His lips were slightly parted, his chest barely rising and falling. His fingers twitched. Then his lips moved. A whisper, so faint they almost didn't hear it. "He is awake. He is coming." Rahul's heart slammed against his ribs. "Who's coming?" But Kabir didn't answer. His mouth fell open wider, as if something inside him wanted to speak, but couldn't. Then they saw it. The mark across Kabir's forearm. Black veins spread like cracks in glass. The skin around them pulsed, shifting as if something slithered beneath. Ananya yanked her hand back. "What the hell is that?" Rahul took an unsteady step away. "I think he's been marked. A vessel for darkness. Footsteps. Not theirs." Something moved outside the shrine. Slow, deliberate, waiting. Rahul pressed himself against the wall, heart hammering. "We need to get out of here." Ananya, still shaking, grabbed Kabir's arm. "We can't leave him." A sharp click echoed through the shrine. The lantern hanging from the ceiling went out. Darkness swallowed them whole. Then the whispers started. Not just one. Many. Low voices, speaking in a language they didn't understand. Some sounded distant, others right beside them. A sharp exhale. Not theirs. Ananya's blood ran cold as a breath brushed against her ear. "He is watching." The shrine shook. The carvings on the walls twisted, contorting into screaming faces. Kabir's body jerked violently. His head snapped back, and a raw, unearthly shriek tore from his throat. Then his body collapsed, limp. Silence. The whispers stopped. The shrine door slammed shut. They were trapped, and something was waiting in the dark. Chapter 6. The Marked Ones. Rahul and Ananya stumbled through the dense, fog-drenched forest, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The air felt heavier, charged with an unnatural stillness. Somewhere ahead, Kabir's scream had cut through the night, then silence. But they weren't alone. The trees loomed like twisted sentinels, their bark engraved with symbols that pulsed faintly under the dim moonlight. Shadows slithered between them, shifting just beyond their vision. The forest was watching. Then Ananya saw it first. A faint glow. She grabbed Rahul's arm and pointed ahead. Through the mist, a structure stood in the clearing. An ancient shrine, forgotten by time. The shrine of the forgotten. The stone walls of the shrine were covered in faded carvings. Human figures with hollowed-out eyes, twisted faces frozen in expressions of agony. The entrance stood wide open, as if inviting them in. Rahul hesitated. This place, it feels wrong. Ananya swallowed hard. Kabir is in there. Steeling themselves, they stepped inside. The scent of damp stone and something metallic filled the air. Blood. The walls were stained with deep crimson, smeared in patterns that seemed deliberate. Symbol spirals and jagged markings ran across the floor, circling the lone figure at the center of the room. Kabir, the marking. He was slumped against the altar, his body unnaturally still. His clothes were torn, his skin pale, but what sent chills through them was his face. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, unblinking. Ananya dropped to her knees, shaking his shoulders. "Kabir, wake up." No response. His lips were slightly parted, his chest barely rising and falling. His fingers twitched. Then his lips moved. A whisper, so faint they almost didn't hear it. "He is awake. He is coming." Rahul's heart slammed against his ribs. "Who's coming?" But Kabir didn't answer. His mouth fell open wider, as if something inside him wanted to speak, but couldn't. Then they saw it. The mark across Kabir's forearm. Black veins spread like cracks in glass. The skin around them pulsed, shifting as if something slithered beneath. Ananya yanked her hand back. "What the hell is that?" Rahul took an unsteady step away. "I think he's been marked." A vessel for darkness. Footsteps. Not theirs. Something moved outside the shrine. Slow. Deliberate. Waiting. Rahul pressed himself against the wall, heart hammering. "We need to get out of here." Ananya, still shaking, grabbed Kabir's arm. "We can't leave him." A sharp click echoed through the shrine. The lantern hanging from the ceiling went out. Darkness swallowed them whole. Then the whispers started. Not just one. Many. Low voices, speaking in a language they didn't understand. Some sounded distant, others right beside them. A sharp exhale. Not theirs. Ananya's blood ran cold as a breath brushed against her ear. "He is watching." The shrine shook. The carvings on the walls twisted, contorting into screaming faces. Kabir's body jerked violently. His head snapped back, and a raw, unearthly shriek tore from his throat. Then his body collapsed, limp. Silence. The whispers stopped. The shrine door slammed shut. They were trapped, and something was waiting in the dark. Chapter 7. The Possession. The journey back to the village was a nightmare. Kabir's body was cold, his breathing shallow, and yet his limbs twitched unnaturally. Rahul and Ananya carried him through the forest, their clothes soaked in sweat despite the icy wind howling between the trees. The whispers followed them. The forest was alive, watching, waiting. By the time they reached the village, the sky had turned a murky shade of gray. No stars, no moon, just an eerie emptiness above them. Old Raghav, the last known descendant of the sorcerer, was already waiting. Bring him inside. Now. A body, no longer his own. Inside Raghav's hut, the air was thick with the smell of incense and burning herbs. Flickering candles cast long, wavering shadows on the walls, illuminating old parchments filled with ancient symbols. Kabir lay in the center of the room, still unconscious. Raghav ran his fingers over a mark on Kabir's forearm, his expression grim. This is not a curse. This is a bond." Ananya swallowed hard. "A bond? To what?" Raghav's eyes, old and weary, lifted to hers. To the thing that lives on Lonar Hill. Rahul tensed. The sorcerer? Raghav shook his head. No, something older, darker. A gust of wind rattled the windows. The flames of the candles flickered wildly. Then Kabir moved. The change. His body convulsed. His arms and legs thrashed against the floor, and his back arched unnaturally high. Then his eyes snapped open. But they weren't his anymore. The pupils were pure black, the whites of his eyes replaced by swirling shadows. Ananya gasped and stumbled back. Kabir? He turned his head toward her, too fast, too sharp. Then, in a voice that was his and not his, he spoke. He is awake. He is inside me. His lips twisted into a smile, unnatural, too wide. You shouldn't have come back. Then he lunged, bound to darkness. Rahul barely had time to react. Kabir's fingers closed around his throat, unnaturally strong. His grip was like iron, crushing, suffocating, but his face remained emotionless. Ananya screamed. Raghav slammed his palm against Kabir's forehead, chanting in a language neither of them understood. The room trembled. Kabir let out a raw, inhuman shriek. His body jerked violently and his grip loosened. Then he collapsed. For a moment, silence. Then he started laughing, low at first, then louder, until it filled the room, chilling them to the bone. Raghav gritted his teeth. He's possessed. Rahul's throat burned from where Kabir had grabbed him. By what? Raghav looked toward the darkened sky outside. Not what? Who? He turned to face them. The hill itself. A deadly revelation. Ananya's stomach twisted. What do you mean? Raghav grabbed an old scroll from his shelf and unrolled it. The parchment was cracked, its ink faded, but the drawings remained clear. A man stood at the center of a circle of shadows, his arms raised, screaming. The shadows were crawling inside him. Rahul stared at the image. The sorcerer? Raghav shook his head. No, the first one. His voice dropped lower. The first human to be claimed by Lonar Hill. The one who started it all. Ananya's blood ran cold. Claimed. Raghav nodded gravely. The hill is alive. It doesn't just haunt. It consumes. A sharp sound rang through the air. Kabir's laughter turned into a sob. His voice shifted, low, ancient, echoing. He is waiting for you. Rahul and Ananya exchanged a look. We have to go back. Raghav's eyes darkened. If you go back, there's no leaving. Ananya's fist clenched. Then we finish what our June started. Kabir lifted his head, his mouth twisting into something between a smile and a snarl. He already knows you're coming. Chapter 8. The Ritual of the Forgotten. The air was heavy with anticipation as they approached the base of Lonar Hill. The blood moon had begun to rise, casting an eerie, crimson hue over the land, bathing everything in a sickly red light. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, like reaching hands, as if the very land itself was trying to keep them from crossing the threshold. Rahul, Ananya, and Raghav trudged through the dense forest. Kabir slung over Raghav's shoulder, his body weak, his movements erratic, flickering between moments of unconsciousness and dark possession. His eyes, once full of life, were now pools of black void, and the whispers of an ancient voice seemed to float around him. He was not himself. He had become a vessel, the first step in the hill's long-awaited return. With each step, the forest grew quieter. The leaves no longer rustled in the breeze. The animals no longer called out from the shadows. All that was left was the sound of their footsteps crunching on the brittle ground beneath them. Ananya's heart raced. They were close now, too close. "We don't have much time," Raghav said, his voice low but filled with urgency. His eyes darted to the sky. The ritual must be performed before the moon reaches its peak. Once the blood moon is fully risen, the barrier between this world and the darkness of Lonar Hill will thin completely. They reached the sacred well, the place where the sorcerer had once sacrificed his love, and where the curse had begun. The well was ancient, a hollow stone structure, its surface slick with decayed moss and blood. The air around it was thick, as though it held the weight of centuries of suffering. The spirits of the past still lingered, trapped in its depths, waiting for a way out. Raghav kneeled by the well, placing Kabir down with a careful reverence. This is where it began. This is where it must end. His voice trembled slightly as he began to unroll an old, worn parchment. The ink was faded, but the symbols on it were still powerful. He muttered a prayer under his breath, his hands tracing the words as he prepared to summon the ritual that would either break the curse or unleash something far worse. Ananya stepped back, her mind a whirlwind of dread and determination. "What exactly do we need to do?" she asked. Raghav glanced up at her, his face a mask of grim resolve. "The ritual will require a sacrifice, a willing soul, the soul of someone marked by the curse. Kabir is the vessel. His soul is already bound to the hill. We need to use his essence to break the curse." Ananya's breath caught in her throat. "A sacrifice? Do you mean Kabir?" Raghav hesitated, his eyes lingering on Kabir's twitching body. "Yes, but not in the way you think. We will not kill him, but we must draw the darkness out of him and bind it to the hill. Only then will the curse be broken." The ground trembled beneath their feet. Something was waking up. The spirits of the hill. As Raghav prepared the ritual, the air around them grew heavier, the weight of unseen eyes upon them. A cold wind whipped through the trees, snapping branches, as the spirits that had been trapped in the hill for centuries began to stir. They whispered, first soft and faint, like a low hum that seemed to come from the very earth beneath them. Then the whispers grew louder, sharper, filled with rage and despair. Ananya's skin prickled. The spirits of the hill, the lost souls of the sorcerer's curse, were awakening. She turned toward the trees, her eyes wide. The shadows among the trunks were moving. Figures, misty and translucent, emerged from the forest. They were the lost souls of those who had come before them. People who had sought to escape the hill's curse and paid the ultimate price. Some were humanoid. Others were nothing but shapeless, shadowy forms, their faces frozen in expressions of eternal torment. "We have to hurry," Raghav warned, his voice cracking slightly as he continued the ritual. "Once the spirits are fully awake, they will fight back." The earth beneath them began to tremble violently, the ground cracking as if the hill itself was trying to rise. Then, from the depths of the well, something stirred. A deep, guttural growl echoed from below. Ananya's breath caught in her throat. "What is that?" Raghav's face turned ashen. "The Forgotten One." From the well, a dark figure emerged, its form shifting in the moonlight. It was taller than any man, its body covered in tattered, decayed robes that fluttered like sails in the wind. Its face was obscured by a shadow, but its eyes glowed with an otherworldly, blood-red light. It was the embodiment of all the darkness and torment that had been locked in the hill for centuries. "It is the first of the cursed," Raghav whispered, his voice barely audible. "The one who started it all. The Forgotten One, the true master of this curse." The figure reached out, its long, skeletal fingers reaching for Kabir. "The time has come," it hissed. "The sacrifice must be made, and the curse shall spread again." The spirits in the trees howled in unison. The ground shook violently, and the air grew thick with malevolent energy. The battle for the soul. Raghav quickly placed his hands on Kabir's chest, chanting faster now, his voice rising above the cacophony of howling spirits and the growls of the Forgotten One. "The light will banish the darkness. The heart will free the soul." Ananya stepped forward, her fear giving way to a fierce determination. "We won't let him take Kabir. We won't let the curse continue." She raised her hand and clutched the pendant around her neck, a gift from her mother, passed down for generations. The pendant was said to hold the power of protection. Holding it tightly, she began to chant a prayer she had learned as a child, something ancient, something that was supposed to protect against evil. The Forgotten One screamed in fury as the light from the pendant flared, piercing the darkness that surrounded it. The spirits screeched in agony as their forms began to dissolve into wind, the curse weakening with each passing moment. But the Forgotten One was not finished. It lunged forward, its hands outstretched, aiming to drag them all into the well. "No!" Raghav shouted, gathering all his strength for the final incantation. "Begone!" A burst of light erupted from the well, blinding them all. Kabir's body jerked violently, as if something was being torn from him. The Forgotten One howled in rage as it was dragged back into the depths of the well, its form dissipating into the shadows once more. The spirits howled and faded, their voices growing distant. The ground stopped shaking. The air became still again. The curse was broken. Kabir lay still on the ground, his breathing slow but steady. The black veins had faded from his skin. He was free, but the price had been paid. Ananya collapsed to her knees, the weight of everything crashing down on her. She had never felt so exhausted in her life. Rahul knelt beside her, his hand gently on her shoulder. "We did it. We're free." But as the dawn's first light broke over the hill, Raghav's voice cut through the stillness. "Not yet." The ritual had broken the curse, but at a cost. The hill was silent now, but the dark forces were still out there, waiting for the next soul. The journey wasn't over. Chapter 9, The Battle of Wills. The sun had barely risen, casting a faint pink glow over the ruined landscape of Lonar Hill. The air was still thick with the remnants of the ritual, whispers of spirits and shadowy figures lingering just out of sight. But something had gone wrong. The hill had been disturbed once again, and the entity that had once been confined to the well was now free, walking among them once more. Kabir, who had been unconscious for most of the ritual, began to stir. At first, it seemed like a normal awakening, but then his eyes opened, black, empty, and void of life. A deep, guttural growl emanated from his throat as he sat up, his body moving unnaturally, as if controlled by an unseen force. The entity had seized him. "No!" Ananya whispered, taking a step back. "It's not Kabir anymore." Raghav's face twisted in horror as he watched Kabir rise, his body jerking in strange, unnatural movements. "The curse is not broken," he said urgently. "The Forgotten One has taken control of him. The ritual, it only severed the connection momentarily. It's still trying to use Kabir as a vessel." The air around them turned cold, and the earth beneath their feet seemed to hum with the power of the ancient curse. "Kabir, no." The Forgotten One in Kabir's body looked at him with eyes that were not his own. His lips curled into a twisted smile, and in that moment, it was clear that he was not in control of his own actions. "He's coming," the Forgotten One hissed, using Kabir's voice. And when he does, none of you will be left standing. Before any of them could react, Kabir lunged. His body was too fast, too strong, unnatural. He was a puppet, but the entity controlling him was powerful. He aimed straight for Ananya, his hands reaching for her throat. "Run!" Rahul shouted, pulling Ananya out of the way just in time. Kabir's hand scraped against the ground, his body contorting like a twisted marionette trying to find its strings. "We need to break the hold," Raghav said, grabbing his staff, his face filled with determination. "I know what must be done, but we don't have much time." Ananya glanced at Kabir, his body writhing and twisting on the ground like it was fighting against the entity that controlled it. She could see the faint gleam of his soul in his eyes, but it was drowned out by the overpowering force that had taken root inside him. She had to save him. He had always been there for her, for all of them. But how? The Forgotten One strikes back. Before they could formulate a plan, the Forgotten One's powers seemed to surge from Kabir's body like a torrent of dark energy. His hand suddenly shot forward, catching Rahul by the throat and lifting him off the ground with unnatural strength. The Forgotten One's voice echoed to Kabir's mouth. It was deeper, colder, like the voice of a long-dead god. "You are all so weak. The power of the curse has returned, and none of you can stop it." Ananya's heart pounded in her chest. "We need to break the connection," she cried out to Raghav. "There must be something we can do." Raghav, his face in a grim expression, stood firm. "There is one way. The well. It holds the only chance to sever the connection completely. But to do so, we must offer a greater sacrifice, one that the Forgotten One cannot fight. We must throw Kabir into the well. Only then can we stop it." Ananya froze. "But Kabir, he'll die," she cried. "Not if we do it right," Raghav replied. "We must force the entity into the well, and Kabir's soul will be freed. The entity will not be able to escape its prison again." Ananya's mind raced. The well was their only hope, but the idea of sacrificing Kabir, even if it meant saving him, was too much to bear. She glanced at Rahul, who was still struggling to break free from Kabir's grip. His eyes were filled with pain and regret. He knew what they had to do. Rahul let out a pained groan. "Do it. I can hold him off. Just hurry." The battle for Kabir's soul. Ananya rushed to Raghav's side, both of them moving quickly as they chanted the incantation to force the Forgotten One into the well. The air was thick with the crackling power of the curse, and as they approached Kabir, the ground beneath them shook violently. The Forgotten One was fighting back, and it was stronger than ever. "You cannot defeat me," the entity roared, throwing Rahul to the side like a rag doll. Kabir's body convulsed, but still he moved forward unstoppable. Ananya's heart ached as she saw Kabir's face contorted in pain. She couldn't lose him, but she had to. They all had to. Raghav began chanting more rapidly, the words coming from him like a prayer, a desperate plea to the ancient forces that had once bound the curse. "By blood, by soul, by the essence of life, release him. Bind the darkness to the depths." The wind howled around them, the forest shaking as the entity screamed in frustration. Kabir's body lunged forward, his eyes burning with fury, but Rahul managed to hold him back long enough to drag him toward the well. "Help me!" Rahul cried out, sweat pouring from his face as he struggled against the entity's strength. Ananya and Raghav rushed forward, combining their strength to force Kabir into the well. For a brief moment, there was a terrifying stillness. The ground trembled beneath them, and the very air seemed to crack, as if the universe was holding its breath. Then, with a sudden, thunderous force, the ground beneath them collapsed. The forgotten one's inhuman screech echoed through the hill, rattling the very bones of the earth. The well began to glow, a blinding light radiating from its depths. Kabir's body jerked violently, and the entity was dragged down, its scream echoing through the land as it was sealed away forever. The light from the well erupted into the sky, casting a brilliant, radiant glow that pushed back the darkness of the hill. The earth stopped shaking, and the cursed energy that had hung over the land for centuries began to dissipate. Aftermath. Ananya, panting and exhausted, fell to her knees. Her eyes were blurry with tears, but she could still see Kabir. He lay at the edge of the well, his body limp, but alive. The black veins on his skin had vanished, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he was free. Rahul approached, his face bruised and bloodied from the battle, but his eyes held nothing but relief. "It's over," he whispered, his voice cracked from the exhaustion. Ananya looked at Kabir, her heart still aching with the weight of what they had done. She had saved him, yes, but the sacrifice had been too great. The hill was no longer cursed, but the memories of what they had endured would haunt them forever. As the sun fully rose, casting its golden light over the once evil hill, a sense of peace settled over the land. But in the quiet aftermath, Ananya knew that they would never forget what had transpired. They had all been changed. But one thing was certain: Lonar Hill would never be the same again. Chapter 10, The Final Toll. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting its first golden rays upon the desolate landscape of Lonar Hill. The air, once thick with malevolent energy, now seemed lighter, though the land still carried an unmistakable weight, a residue of the terror that had plagued it for centuries. Ananya, Kabir, and Rahul stood in the clearing near the well, gazing at the now silent hill. The curse had been broken, the spirits freed, and the forgotten one banished forever. Yet the atmosphere felt different. The dawn's light revealed the scars of the battle that had been fought, not just on the land, but within each of them. Kabir woke first, stirring from his unconscious state, his breath shallow but steady. As his eyes fluttered open, a moment of confusion passed over his face. For a split second he seemed lost, as if waking from a deep, unremembered nightmare. Then his gaze fell upon Ananya, and recognition flickered in his eyes. He tried to sit up, his movements weak at first, but then they grew steadier. "Ananya?" His voice was hoarse, full of weariness, yet beneath the fatigue, there was something lighter in him, something free. Ananya knelt beside him, her heart both heavy and relieved. She placed a gentle hand on his arm, the warmth of his skin grounding her. "You're back, Kabir," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "The curse is broken. You're free." But even as she spoke, there was a sadness in her heart that she could not shake. Kabir's eyes, though clearer than they had been when the forgotten one had controlled him, held a distant, haunted look. It was as if part of him had been lost in the depths of the hill, taken by the entity that had once lived within him. The bond that had been forged between them during the ordeal was strong, but there was something in his eyes now that spoke of shift, a subtle change in him that could not be undone. Rahul, who had been standing a little farther away, watching the reunion with quiet intensity, spoke up. His voice was rough from the fight, his wound still fresh, but his expression was one of quiet acceptance. "It's over, but none of us will ever be the same." Ananya looked at him, and her heart clenched. "What do you mean?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Rahul sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "The curse is broken, yes, but the land, the well, it still remembers. And so do we." Ananya felt the truth of his words in her bones. Though the curse had been lifted, the echoes of the past still haunted them. They had witnessed things that no one should ever have to endure, and those experiences would be forever etched in their souls. They all stood in silence for a moment, the air around them thick with unspoken thoughts, when suddenly the ground beneath them trembled, just a faint quiver at first, but unmistakable. Ananya stiffened, her heart racing. "Did you feel that?" Kabir rose unsteadily to his feet, his eyes scanning the hill. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice tight with apprehension. Rahul, too, was alert, his senses heightened. "The hill, it's reacting." The mist, which had begun to dissipate with the dawn, started to thicken once more, rolling over the hills like a creeping shadow. It moved in unnatural waves, winding through the trees, enveloping the land in an ominous shroud. Ananya's stomach tightened. No, not again. But it wasn't just a mist. There was something in the air now, a subtle but unmistakable presence. The spirits that had once roamed the hill seemed to stir once again. Ananya felt a strained connection to them, an unspoken understanding that tugged at her very core. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to center herself. "It's not over," she murmured. Her voice sounded distant, as if coming from somewhere deep within her. "The curse may have been broken, but the land, it doesn't forget, and neither do we." Kabir stepped forward, his brow furrowed with confusion and fear. "But we defeated the Forgotten One. We released the spirits. The curse should be gone." Ananya shook her head slowly. "Some curses never truly end. They linger, waiting to take root again. Maybe not in the form they once had, but they find other ways." Rahul's face hardened. "The land has tasted the power of the curse. It may never fully heal." They stood together, watching as the mist continued to envelop the hill, growing denser with every passing second. It seemed almost as if the hill was regenerating itself, its ancient malevolence crawling back into its bones. "What does this mean for us?" Kabir asked, his voice filled with both fear and realization. Ananya felt the weight of the question settle heavily on her chest. She looked up at the hill, feeling the spirits stir within her, their presence undeniable now. "We've broken the physical curse. But the land itself will always carry the memory of its past. And we," her voice trailed off as she realized the truth, "we are forever tied to it. We'll always feel it," Rahul added grimly, his expression unreadable. "The hill, the spirits, they're part of us now. We can never truly walk away from this." For a long time, there was nothing but the sound of the wind in the trees and the faint rustling of leaves beneath their feet. The land was eerily quiet, but the feeling of something unseen lingered in the air. Finally, with a heavy heart, Ananya turned to face her companions. "We can't stay here. It's time for us to leave." They had done everything they could. The curse had been broken. But at what cost? The hill would never be the same, and neither would they. There were no easy answers, no perfect resolutions. The evil that had once ruled the land had been defeated, but the shadow of its memory would forever hang over them. As they made their way down the hill, the mist began to thin, though it remained a constant presence in the distance. The journey to leave the hill felt like a slow, deliberate march, a quiet finality settling over them. They didn't look back, but as they approached the village, Ananya couldn't help but steal one last glance at Lonar Hill. The land had been freed, but the cost of that freedom was a silent toll that none of them could escape. And as they left, the mist around the hill thickened once more, swirling into a dense fog that seemed to hide all that had happened before. Because some curses never truly end.